General Vecth Thural had not been invited to the officers' banquet at Amistrar Station, but he came anyway, because the alternative was sitting alone in his quarters listening to the recycled air hiss through vents that needed cleaning, and even bad company was sometimes better than none. He was 61 years old by Calrothy reckoning, which made him something close to 90 by the human calendar he'd once been made to memorize in painstaking detail, back when studying humans had still been considered a reasonable use of an officer's time. He had pale gray skin, ridged along the jaw the way all Calrothy males were once they passed their 40th cycle, and eyes the color of old amber that had gone slightly cloudy in the left one from a wound he did not discuss. Nobody at the banquet made room for him at their tables. He noticed this the way he noticed everything now, quietly, without visible reaction, filing it away with the same flat attention he gave to fleet manifests and supply reports. He found a seat near the end of a long table occupied mostly by junior logistics officers too polite or too indifferent to move. General Thural, said one of them, a young woman named Ossa Prin with the bright, unscarred confidence of someone who had never lost anything that mattered. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I go where the food is free," Thural said, and poured himself a glass of something amber and faintly bitter, and did not elaborate. Across the hall, seated at the high table beneath the Empire's banner, Fleet Marshal Dovrik Kess was holding court, laughing loudly at something one of the noble delegates had said. Kess was younger than Thural by almost 15 years, decorated for 3 campaigns against species that had barely managed to leave their own solar systems before the Empire arrived to correct that oversight. He had never fought anyone who fought back properly. Thural had watched his career rise the way you watched weather form on a distant horizon, inevitable, and eventually going to matter to you whether you wanted it to or not. "They're voting on the Sol proposal next week," Ossa said, following his gaze. "The Trade Council wants tribute rights over the human systems. Full annexation terms, if they refuse." Thural's hand went very still around his glass. "Is that so?" he said. "You fought them once, didn't you?" Ossa asked, with the careless curiosity of someone asking about ancient history rather than a wound that had never properly closed. "The Kelvara incident." "That was you." "That was me," Thural said. "What were they like?" He looked at her for a long moment, at her bright, uncomplicated face, and thought about how to answer a question that had no honest answer short enough to fit inside a banquet hall. "Attentive," he finally said. "They were very attentive." She laughed, assuming it was a joke. He didn't correct her. Another officer further down the table, an older logistics coordinator named Bresson who had served during roughly the same era as Thural, though never in combat, leaned in with the particular gleam of someone who enjoyed a good war story regardless of whether the man telling it wanted to tell it. "Come now, General," Bresson said. 30 years and you've never once told the full account. Half the fleet thinks you're exaggerating for sympathy. The other half thinks you're hiding something worse than what actually happened. The second half is closer to correct, Thural said, though not in the way you mean. "Then tell it," Bresson pressed, and a few of the younger officers around the table, sensing entertainment, leaned in as well. "One old soldier's story, for the room." Thural considered refusing, as he had refused 100 times before at 100 similar tables. But something about the timing, the vote a week away, the room full of officers who had never fired a shot in anger at anything that could genuinely fire back, made him reconsider. "Very well," he said, and set down his glass. "But you'll want to actually listen, because nobody who's asked me to tell it before ever has." 31 years earlier, Vecth Thural had commanded the light cruiser Ashren's Pride, part of a 3-ship patrol assigned to the Kelvara Reach, a scattering of unclaimed systems on the far edge of Calrothy expansion, valuable mostly for the mineral wealth in its asteroid fields and, as it turned out, entirely unknown at the time to be within range of a species that had only just begun venturing past its own home system. The first contact had been almost comically small. A single unarmed human survey vessel, mapping the outer edge of what its crew apparently believed was unclaimed space, had drifted into a system the Calrothy Empire considered sovereign territory. Thural, following standard doctrine for unauthorized incursions by unknown species, had ordered the vessel intercepted and boarded, its crew detained pending assessment. It had seemed, at the time, entirely routine. He had run 100 operations like it against a dozen different minor species over the course of his career, and every one of them had ended the same way, some combination of surrender, negotiation, and quiet absorption into the Empire's periphery. The humans had surrendered. That part, at least, had gone as expected. What happened over the following 11 days had not. The survey vessel's crew, for humans, unarmed, non-military by every scan and record Thural's intelligence officers could find, had been detained aboard the Ashren's Pride while the Empire's legal apparatus worked through the tedious process of determining jurisdiction, compensation, and appropriate resettlement terms. It was, by Calrothy standards, a generous process, one that had ended peacefully for dozens of other species over the decades. On the 6th day, a second human vessel arrived in the system. It was not a warship, not by any classification the Empire's sensors initially recognized. It was, according to the scans, a converted mining transport, retrofitted with weapons that made no immediate sense to Thural's tactical officers, none of the elegant, efficient directed energy systems the Empire favored, but something older-looking, blunter, that their threat assessment algorithms initially flagged as low priority. The ship broadcast a single message, translated imperfectly by the Ashren's Pride's linguistic systems, which had at that point processed perhaps 40 hours of recorded human speech, most of it from the detained survey crew. "Return our people. You have 1 hour." Thural remembered laughing when the translation reached him. One converted mining ship, against a Calrothy light cruiser and its 2 escort vessels, issuing an ultimatum with a deadline. It had seemed, in the moment, almost sweet, the kind of bravado a young, frightened species might attempt when it didn't yet understand the scale of the mistake it had made. He had not returned the detained crew within the hour. He had, instead, ordered the human transport intercepted and warned that continued aggressive posturing would result in its destruction. The hour passed. What happened next had taken, by the Ashren's Pride's own combat logs, 11 minutes from first exchange of fire to the destruction of both Calrothy escort vessels and catastrophic damage to Thural's own cruiser. The human ship's obsolete kinetic weapons had punched through Calrothy shielding with a brutal, almost contemptuous efficiency, each impact delivering more raw destructive force than the Empire's threat models had accounted for, because the Empire's threat models had never seriously considered kinetic weapons a threat worth accounting for. Thural had lost 41 crew members in those 11 minutes. He had lost his left eye to a shrapnel wound when the bridge's secondary display array shattered under an impact tremor. He had, in the confused, blood-soaked aftermath, given the order to release the detained human crew and withdraw, an order that had, in the years since, been quietly recorded in his service file as "tactical retreat under extreme duress," a phrase that managed to be both accurate and to say almost nothing true about what had actually happened. What the official records did not capture, because there had been no way to translate it into a tactical assessment anyone above him wanted to read, was the thing that had actually broken something in him during those 11 minutes, not the losses, terrible as they were, but the calm with which the human vessel had fought. There had been no rage in the ship's movements, no desperate, reckless aggression of a smaller force lashing out against overwhelming odds. There had been precision. Patience. The unhurried, methodical work of someone who had already decided exactly how the engagement would end before it began, and was simply carrying out the necessary steps to get there. He had spent the following 3 decades trying to explain that distinction to people who had never seen it, and had never once succeeded. The 11 minutes themselves, when he finally told them properly to the table of officers who had asked for a story and gotten something closer to a confession, unfolded in his memory with a clarity that never dulled no matter how many years passed. The first exchange had come from the human ship's opening salvo, not a full barrage, he explained, but a single, almost testing shot, as if the vessel's gunnery crew wanted to confirm their weapons' performance against Calrothy shielding before committing to anything larger. It had struck the escort cruiser Vantis Reach along its forward quarter, and Thural remembered watching, on the Ashren's Pride's tactical display, as the Vantis Reach's shield indicator, a steady, reassuring green bar that every Calrothy officer had been trained since cadet school to trust, dropped to 0 in a single frame, with no gradual bleed down, no warning flicker. One shot. One shield generator, rated to withstand sustained directed energy bombardment for the better part of an hour, gone in an instant. None of his crew had time to properly process before the second shot arrived and took the ship's engines with it. We did not understand, in that moment, what we were fighting, Thural told the table, his voice quieter now, the banquet's ambient noise fading into background as the officers around him leaned closer despite themselves. Our doctrine assumed shields degraded. That was the entire premise our combat training was built on. You absorb damage, you calculate remaining capacity, you make tactical decisions based on how much punishment you can still take. The human weapon did not degrade our shields. It answered a question our shields had never been asked before, and the answer was simply that they were not there anymore. The second escort, the Corrimal's Wrath, had attempted evasive maneuvers, breaking formation and attempting to open distance. A reasonable response, by any standard Calrothy doctrine, to an unknown threat of unclear range and lethality. It had not helped. The human vessel had adjusted its firing solution with a speed that Thural's own tactical officers, reviewing the combat logs in the exhausted, grief-stricken days that followed, estimated would have required either extraordinarily advanced predictive targeting systems or a gunnery crew operating with a level of trained precision that made the distinction between advanced technology and advanced skill feel almost irrelevant. By the 4th minute, Thural continued, both of my escorts were dead in space or destroyed outright. My own ship had taken damage to its port shield array and lost communications with our aft sections entirely. And here is the part, gentlemen, that none of the official reports capture. Because there is no box on the standard incident form for it, the human ship did not press its advantage. It did not close distance to finish us while it clearly could have. It held position, and it repeated its message. Return our people, Ossa said quietly, remembering. Return our people, Thural confirmed. The same 4 words? Not gloating. Not threatening further violence. Simply repeating the original, reasonable request it had made an hour earlier, as though the intervening carnage had been nothing more than the necessary proof required to make us take the request seriously. He paused. I gave the order to release the detained crew within 30 seconds of receiving that second transmission. It is the fastest decision I have made in my entire career, and it remains the only one I have never once regretted." The table was silent for a long moment. Bresson, who had asked for the story expecting something closer to an adventure, looked, for the first time that evening, genuinely uncomfortable. "And the eye?" he finally asked, more quietly than before. "Shrapnel, from our own display array, during the 3rd minute," Thural said. "A minor wound, in the scheme of that day. I mention it only because people find it easier to ask about a missing eye than about 41 dead crew members, and I have learned, over 30 years, to let them ask the easier question." After Kelvara, Thural had been reassigned, not demoted exactly, but shifted sideways into a series of postings that kept him far from any position of real command influence. He understood why, even if he resented it. An officer who had lost 2 ships and 41 lives to a single unarmed mining vessel was not an officer the Empire wanted, commanding fleets regardless of the circumstances. He had spent those years doing the only useful thing left available to him: he studied. The postings themselves were a kind of quiet punishment disguised as administrative necessity: supply coordination on a backwater listening post, logistics oversight for a shipyard that mostly repaired civilian freighters, 3 years spent auditing fuel requisitions for a border fleet that never saw combat. He performed each assignment competently, without complaint, and used what remained of his time, which was considerable, to pursue the work that no one above him believed mattered. He was, by the standards of his peers, a man whose career had quietly ended at Kelvara, even though his life had not. He watched, over those years, officers he had once outranked rise past him into positions of real authority, and he found, to his own surprise, that it bothered him less than he expected. He had lost something at Kelvara that ambition alone could not restore, and he had stopped, somewhere in the first decade of his long exile from meaningful command, measuring his worth by the same scale most of his colleagues still used. He never married, never had children of his own, a fact that a handful of well-meaning colleagues over the years had gently suggested was part of what made his obsession with a single old battle so consuming. He did not entirely disagree with them. There was, he sometimes admitted to himself in the quiet hours of his private log, a kind of grim comfort in devoting the whole of a life to a single unresolved question, rather than dividing that devotion across the ordinary comforts other people built for themselves. It was not a choice he recommended to anyone. It was simply the shape his life had taken, in the years after 11 minutes had changed the entire trajectory of everything that came after. He requisitioned every scrap of intelligence the Empire's various listening posts and trade contacts had gathered on humanity. Over the following decades, a slow, patient accumulation of data that most of his superiors considered a harmless, faintly pathetic hobby, the obsession of a broken old officer who couldn't let go of the worst day of his career. What he found, over those years, only deepened his conviction that Kelvara had not been an aberration. Humanity, it turned out, had spent the intervening decades doing exactly what a species that took Kelvara seriously would do. They had built. Not flashy, not for show, not with the kind of triumphant public announcements other species made when they developed new military technology. They had built quietly, incrementally, absorbing lessons from every skirmish and border dispute the way a smith absorbed the lessons of every blade that failed, refining and rebuilding without ever seeming satisfied that the work was finished. He tracked, through fragmentary trade reports and the occasional leaked intelligence summary from other Concord-adjacent powers, a pattern of human engagements with various minor and mid-tier galactic powers over the following 20 years. Pirates who attacked human shipping lanes stopped attacking them abruptly and permanently after specific, undocumented incidents that left no survivors willing to discuss what had happened. A resource dispute with a mid-sized trading consortium ended after 18 months of careful, non-violent negotiation, with a single naval demonstration that the consortium's own diplomatic cables, which Thural had acquired through channels he preferred not to examine too closely, described as the quietest, most complete military humiliation in our fleet's 400-year history. He compiled all of it, every fragment, every rumor, every scrap of hard data, into a single classified assessment that he submitted to Fleet Command 11 years after Calvara, at a point in his career when he had finally clawed his way back into a mid-level advisory position, close enough to influence policy that he'd allowed himself, for the first time in over a decade, a small and foolish hope that someone might actually listen. The assessment was 200 pages long. Its conclusion was 6 words. Do not engage humanity without overwhelming caution. It was read, according to the administrative log he checked obsessively for the following year, by exactly 3 officers above his own rank, none of whom responded to it in writing, and one of whom, a young staff aide to Fleet Marshal Kess, who was then a rising captain rather than the decorated marshal he'd become, reportedly described it in a private conversation as the ravings of an old man who never got over losing an eye to farmers. The phrase reached Thural secondhand, months later, from an aide who thought he'd want to know. He had not wanted to know. He had filed it away anyway, with the same flat, careful attention he gave everything now, and gone back to work. The assessment he had submitted was not, in truth, a single document but the compressed summary of a much larger private archive he maintained across the following 2 decades, growing steadily as new fragments of intelligence crossed his desk, each one a small, separate confirmation of the pattern he had first glimpsed over Calvara. The Hedrasai incident, 9 years after Calvara, involved a mid-tier piracy consortium operating out of a nebula cluster that human shipping had, for several years, treated as an unavoidable cost of doing business along a particular trade corridor, paying informal tribute, rerouting valuable cargo, accepting occasional losses as the price of operating in contested space. Thural had acquired, through a Hedrasai trade contact who owed him a favor from an unrelated matter, a partial account of what happened when human patience for that arrangement finally ran out. There had been no formal declaration, no ultimatum, nothing that resembled the diplomatic theater the Calrothy Empire favored. Simply, over the course of 11 days, every vessel known to belong to the consortium's senior leadership was located, boarded or destroyed, and removed from operation, while the consortium's lower-tier assets, the smaller crews, the desperate and the coerced, were left entirely untouched. The message, delivered afterward through the same trade channels the consortium had once used to extract tribute, had been simple: leadership responsible for targeting human shipping has been addressed. This corridor is no longer available for that purpose. Choose your next occupation carefully. The piracy in that corridor did not resume. Thural had found, in the years since, no comparable incident of a major power dismantling an entrenched criminal network with that degree of surgical restraint, sparing the many while removing the few actually responsible. The Corvain Consortium dispute, 14 years after Calvara, offered a different lesson entirely, one about patience rather than precision. A resource disagreement over a contested asteroid belt had dragged on for the better part of 2 years, with human negotiators engaging in what Thural's intelligence sources described as an almost maddening degree of procedural patience. Repeated proposals, counter-proposals, formal mediation requests, all pursued with a calm thoroughness that the consortium's own negotiators reportedly mistook, at length, for weakness or reluctance to escalate. When the consortium finally moved unilaterally to seize the disputed territory, deploying a modest but respectable defense fleet to enforce the claim, the human response had come within 6 hours. A single demonstration strike against the consortium's flagship, delivered with enough precision to disable rather than destroy it, followed immediately by a renewed, entirely unchanged offer to resume the exact negotiation terms that had been on the table for the previous 2 years. The consortium accepted those terms within the week. Thural had read the leaked internal assessment the consortium's own naval command produced afterward, and one line from it had stayed with him for years: "We mistook 2 years of patience for an absence of options." We were given, in 6 hours, unambiguous proof that patience had simply been their chosen method of pursuing exactly the outcome they eventually took by force. He compiled a dozen more such incidents over the years, smaller, less documented, but consistent in shape. A species that preferred negotiation, sometimes to a degree that read to others as passivity or weakness, and that when negotiation finally failed, did not escalate gradually the way Calrothy doctrine assumed any rational actor would. They simply, and without visible anger, applied exactly the amount of force required to permanently resolve whatever problem had made escalation necessary, and then stopped and returned, almost immediately, to offering the same reasonable terms they had been offering all along. Perhaps the most instructive of these smaller incidents, at least to Thural's own thinking, involved not a battle at all but a diplomatic exchange he obtained years later through a retired Thren intelligence contact who had, at the time, been present for the negotiations firsthand. A minor territorial dispute along a shared border had escalated to the point of formal grievance, and the Thren delegation, expecting the usual protracted negotiation process common among Concord-adjacent powers, had been startled when the human representative, the same Elena Reyes who would later reject the Calrothy ultimatum, proposed resolving the matter with a single binding arbitration session, rather than the years of maneuvering typically involved in such disputes. When asked why humanity preferred such an unusually direct approach, her answer, as Thural's contact recalled it, had been simple: "We've found that drawn-out disputes cost more, in the long run, than quick, fair resolutions, even when the quick resolution occasionally costs us more in the short term. We would rather spend a little more now than let a grievance fester into something neither side can walk back from later." It was, Thural came to believe, as close to a summary of humanity's entire approach to conflict as he ever found in 3 decades of searching: not aggression, not passivity, but an unusually consistent preference for resolving problems completely, the first time, rather than letting them accumulate into something worse. It was this pattern, more than any single engagement, that had convinced Thural of the conclusion he spent the following years failing to make anyone else believe: that humanity's restraint was not evidence of limitation. It was evidence of a species that had, at some point in its history he had never been able to fully trace, learned to treat violence as a tool of last resort precisely because it had also learned how completely, efficiently, and permanently that tool could resolve a problem once employed. They were patient, he came to believe, not because they lacked capability, but because they understood better than almost anyone the Empire had encountered exactly how much capability they possessed, and exactly how rarely it needed to be used. The sole proposal, as Ossiprin had called it at the banquet, was not new. Thural had watched it circulate through the Empire's trade and expansion committees for nearly 3 years in various forms, each version slightly more aggressive than the last as the political pressure behind it grew. The pressure, he understood well enough, had nothing to do with humanity itself and everything to do with the Empire's internal politics. The court had been fractured for a decade by disputes between the old noble houses and the newer merchant conglomerates that had grown wealthy on trade routes the nobles no longer fully controlled. A war, a clean, decisive, glorious war against a target the court had been assured was manageable, was exactly the kind of unifying spectacle a fractured court needed, and human space, sitting at the edge of Concord-adjacent territory with resource-rich systems and, by the official Imperial intelligence assessment, a military force barely worth the name, made an appealing target. Thural had submitted formal objections to that official assessment 4 separate times over the preceding 18 months. He had been granted, after considerable effort, a seat at the final War Council session, not as a voting member, his rank having never fully recovered from Calvara, but as a technical advisor permitted to speak before the vote. The council chamber was a wide, tiered room beneath the Imperial Assembly's central dome, its walls lined with the preserved banners of 100 successful campaigns. Fleet Marshal Kess sat at the center of the high table, flanked by senior representatives of the merchant houses and the remaining loyal nobility. Thural stood at the lower podium, the same podium from which he had delivered increasingly desperate warnings for the better part of 2 decades, and looked up at faces that had already, he could tell from their posture alone, made up their minds. "Marshal," he began, "members of the council. I ask you, one final time, to review the full assessment I submitted regarding human military capability before this vote proceeds." "We have reviewed it, General," Kess said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "Extensively. Your service and your caution are noted and respected. Then you understand the risk." "We understand," said one of the merchant delegates, a broad, well-fed man named Corvain Oleth, whose family had spent 3 generations building shipping fortunes on trade routes the Empire's fleet kept safe, "that Calvara was 31 years ago, General. That the Empire's fleet doctrine, weapons technology, and shielding have advanced considerably since then. That the human forces you encountered were, by every current assessment, a fraction of what our own fleets could bring to bear today." "With respect," Thural said, and he could hear, even as he said it, how tired his own voice sounded, "you are assuming they have not advanced as much as we have. I have spent 31 years gathering evidence that this assumption is incorrect. Evidence gathered from rumor and second-hand trade cable," Kess said. "Not from any confirmed engagement in over a decade. Because nobody who has confirmed an engagement with them in the last decade has survived to file a report that contradicts you," Thural said, and the room went very quiet, and he understood, in that silence, that he had already lost. Corvain Oleth leaned forward, folding his broad hands together on the table with the air of a man about to deliver what he considered a closing argument. "General, I do not doubt your sincerity. I do not doubt that Calvara happened exactly as you describe it. But I would ask you to consider that your entire assessment is built on a single data point 31 years old, supplemented by fragments and rumors you yourself admit you cannot verify. This council is not being asked to gamble the Empire's future on a hunch. We are being asked to enforce trade terms against a species whose own diplomatic posture has been, by every account, conciliatory. If they were truly as dangerous as you suggest, would they not have demonstrated it more plainly by now, in the 31 years since?" "That," Thural said, "is precisely the danger, Delegate. You are reading their restraint as proof of weakness. I am telling you it is proof of exactly the opposite. A species with something to prove announces itself. A species with nothing left to prove waits, and answers only when it must. A convenient theory, Oleth said, not unkindly, that happens to be unfalsifiable. If they act aggressively, you would say it confirms the danger. If they act peacefully, you say that also confirms the danger. At some point, General, caution of this kind becomes indistinguishable from an inability to ever be wrong. There was a low murmur of agreement around the table, and Thural felt, not for the first time in that room, the particular exhaustion of a man watching a reasonable-sounding argument built entirely on the wrong foundation win out over an unreasonable-sounding truth. I would remind the Council, he said, that I have never once claimed certainty about how this would unfold. I have claimed only that the cost of being wrong in one direction, excessive caution, delayed trade rights, a slower expansion timeline, is a cost this empire can easily absorb. And that the cost of being wrong in the other direction is not a cost anyone in this room has adequately priced, because none of you were in the room when the price was last paid. Kess raised a hand before Oleth could respond, and the gesture carried enough authority that the room settled again. General Thural, Kess said. Your caution is a matter of record. It will be noted in the Council minutes. But this empire cannot govern itself by the ghost of one bad day 3 decades past. Our fleets have grown. Our shielding technology has been revised 4 times since your engagement. Every serious military analyst in this empire, save one, agrees that the threat you describe, whatever its historical merit, does not reflect the current balance of power. The vote will proceed. The vote proceeded. It was not close. Of the 41 council members present, 36 voted in favor of the sole annexation directive, a formal ultimatum demanding tribute and trade concessions from the human systems, backed by the immediate mobilization of the 2nd and 4th fleets, with explicit authorization for full military action should the ultimatum be refused. Thural remained standing at the lower podium long after the chamber had begun to empty, staring at the tally displayed on the central screen, 36 votes glowing in cold blue light, until an aide gently reminded him that the room needed to be cleared for the next session. The formal ultimatum was transmitted to Earth's government 8 days later, delivered by a diplomatic courier vessel escorted by a token honor guard of 3 light cruisers, a gesture meant to convey seriousness without appearing overtly aggressive, the kind of careful diplomatic theater the Empire had performed successfully against dozens of other minor powers over the centuries. Thural was not part of the delegation. He had not been invited, and had not expected to be. His usefulness to the Empire, as far as anyone above him was concerned, had ended the moment the vote concluded. He spent the following weeks at his administrative posting on Amistrar Station, monitoring the diplomatic feeds through channels technically available to any officer of his rank, watching the exchange unfold with the particular, helpless attention of a man watching a slow-motion collision he had spent 31 years trying to prevent. The human response, when it came, was almost aggressively unremarkable. There was no outrage, no bluster, no counter-threat. Earth's representative, a woman named Elena Reyes, whose name Thural recognized from intelligence summaries as a senior figure in humanity's small but growing diplomatic corps, responded to the ultimatum with a message so measured, so calmly procedural, that several of the Empire's own diplomatic analysts initially flagged it as evidence of weakness or confusion. The Sol systems are sovereign human territory under established interstellar precedent. We decline the tribute demand. We would welcome continued trade discussions on mutually equitable terms. We do not want conflict with the Calrothy Empire and will not initiate one. We would ask, in turn, that the Empire consider carefully what it is choosing to begin. Thural read that final line more times than he could later account for. We would ask that the Empire consider carefully what it is choosing to begin. Not a threat. Not bravado. A warning, delivered with the same flat, unhurried calm he remembered from 11 minutes over Calvara 3 decades earlier, and he understood, reading it, that nothing important had changed about who humanity was in the intervening years. Only, perhaps, what they had built. He drafted one final memo that night, addressed directly to Fleet Marshal Kess, outside any official channel, written in language stripped of all the careful diplomatic hedging he'd spent a career learning to use. Marshal, I am not asking you to listen to me as an officer whose judgment you respect. I understand you do not. I am asking you to listen to me as the only man in this empire who has actually watched what happens when their patience runs out. It will not look like a battle. It will look like an ending. Please, for the sake of every crew member about to board those ships, reconsider. He received no reply. He had not expected one. The days between the rejection of the ultimatum and the fleet's formal departure carried a strange, suspended quality that Thural would remember for the rest of his life. Not the frantic energy of a court bracing for imminent conflict, but something closer to a festival atmosphere, as though the coming operation were less a war than a celebration whose date had simply been fixed in advance. He watched merchant delegates draft preliminary resource extraction proposals for territories that had not yet been conquered. He watched junior officers request transfers onto the departing fleet specifically for the career advancement a swift, decisive victory would provide. He attended, out of a grim obligation he could not quite explain even to himself, a small private gathering hosted by several of the more senior naval families, at which the assembled guests toasted a short, clean campaign with an ease that made something in his chest tighten painfully. He tried, twice more in those final days, to reach individual council members directly, outside the formal channels that had already failed him 4 times. Both attempts were politely but firmly rebuffed. One delegate's aide informing him that the council's decision had been made and further lobbying would only prolong an unnecessary discomfort for everyone involved. He understood, hearing that phrase, exactly how thoroughly the matter had already been settled in the minds of everyone who mattered, and how little his 31 years of evidence weighed against the simple, comfortable momentum of a decision already made. In the days after sending that memo, before the fleets had even departed, Thural found himself doing something he had not done in over a decade. He visited the small, quiet memorial garden on Amistrar Station's lower ring, a modest space maintained more out of institutional obligation than genuine reverence, where the names of Calrothy service members lost in various minor engagements over the decades were etched into simple stone markers. He found, near the back of the garden, the marker bearing the names of the 41 crew members he had lost over Calvara 31 years earlier. He had visited it perhaps 5 times in 3 decades, each visit an occasion he dreaded and then, afterward, was quietly grateful to have endured. He read the names slowly, as he always did, though he had long since memorized every one of them. Ensign Corvel Tash, 22 years old, 3 months into his first deployment. Weapons Officer Ileana Vresh, who had transferred to the Ashren's Pride specifically because she'd wanted to serve under Thural, having heard good things about his leadership from a mutual colleague, a decision that had cost her everything, and that Thural had never fully forgiven himself for accepting her transfer request in the first place. He stood there for a long time, in the quiet garden, and found himself speaking aloud, softly, to no one in particular, the way he sometimes did now when the weight of 31 years of unheeded warnings grew too heavy to carry silently. "I tried again," he told the stone marker, told Ilyana Vresh and Corvel Tash and the 39 others whose names he knew as well as his own. "I don't know if it will matter more this time than it did the others. I am afraid it will not. I am afraid there will be new names to add to gardens like this one, in stations I will never visit, belonging to families I will never meet, and that I will have to carry the knowledge that I saw it coming and could not make anyone else see it in time." He did not know, standing there, that within a matter of weeks he would be proven entirely, catastrophically correct, and that the garden's modest stone markers would soon need considerable expansion to accommodate the names of 161 ships' worth of crew. He returned to his quarters that evening and, for the first time in years, allowed himself to feel the full, unguarded weight of what he suspected was coming, not the flat, careful composure he presented to council chambers and banquet halls, but something rawer, closer to grief, mourned in advance for people who had not yet died, because he understood, with a certainty that had never once failed him where humanity was concerned, exactly what the coming weeks would cost. The second and fourth fleets departed for human space 11 days after the ultimatum's rejection, a combined force of over 200 vessels, including 6 of the Empire's newest heavy dreadnoughts, escorted by supply trains and a full complement of ground assault forces intended for the occupation phase that fleet commands. Official planning documents assumed would follow a swift, decisive victory. Thural watched the fleet's departure from a viewing gallery on Amistrar Station, standing slightly apart from the small crowd of officers and dignitaries who had gathered to watch, most of them in high spirits, several of them already discussing which human systems would make the most valuable additions to their own trading portfolios once annexation was complete. Fleet Marshal Kess himself commanded the operation from the flagship Amistrar's Glory, a decision the court had celebrated as a fitting symbol of the Empire's confidence, its most decorated living officer, personally leading the campaign that would settle, once and for all, the question of whether the young human species deserved to remain independent of imperial authority. Thural had requested, through every channel still open to him, a position aboard the fleet, not command. He no longer expected that, but any position that would let him serve in a capacity where his 3 decades of study might actually matter when the fighting began. He was refused. Politely, but firmly. His presence, one administrator explained without any apparent irony, might be seen as undermining confidence in the operation's leadership. So he watched from the gallery instead, as 200 ships lit their transit drives and vanished, one by one, into the dark, carrying with them the confidence of a court that had never once seriously entertained the possibility that they might be wrong. He went back to his quarters that night and began, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate even to himself, compiling a private log, a record, separate from any official file, of everything he knew and everything he feared, addressed to no one in particular, written in the manner of a man who suspected he was about to become the only witness to something no one else would believe. Aboard the Amistrar's Glory, in the days following departure, Fleet Marshal Kess held a preliminary staff briefing that would later be reconstructed, in fragments, from the accounts of officers who survived the campaign. It was, by every description that eventually reached Thural, a confident, almost celebratory affair. Kess had walked his assembled captains through the operational plan with the easy authority of a man who had won every campaign he'd ever led, using the same phrase, measured, decisive force, that had appeared in nearly every public statement the Empire had made about the operation. "We are not here to annihilate a species," Kess reportedly told his assembled officers, according to the partial transcript later recovered from the flagship's damaged data core. "We are here to demonstrate, clearly and unmistakably, that resistance to imperial authority carries a cost the humans cannot afford to pay twice. A show of force sufficient to end this before it truly begins. I expect this campaign concluded within the week." One officer, a younger cruiser captain named Yevasorn, who had, unlike most of her peers, actually read Thural's classified assessment during a brief posting to Fleet Intelligence 3 years earlier, reportedly raised a cautious question during that briefing about contingency planning should the human defense prove more capable than projected. The transcript recorded Kess's response only briefly, a dismissal, polite but firm, noting that Imperial intelligence had assessed human military capability at less than a third of the combined 2nd and 4th Fleet's total strength, and that excessive caution risked projecting weakness to a species that, in Kess's own words, responds best to confidence. Sorn did not raise the question again. She would, weeks later, be among the 45 vessels that limped home, and among the small number of officers who privately sought out Thural afterward, unprompted, to tell him she wished she had pushed harder. The first dispatches from the fleet reached Amistrar Station 19 days after departure, relayed through a chain of communication buoys along the transit route, and they were, initially, exactly as triumphant as everyone had expected. Fleet has entered the outer Sol system without incident. Human forces observed, minimal. Estimated 11 vessels of corvette class or smaller detected on long-range sensors. Proceeding to primary engagement position per operational plan. Thural read that dispatch standing in the officers' mess, over the shoulder of a young communications officer who had pulled it up on a public display, and felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with relief. 11 vessels of corvette class or smaller. He had read enough fragmentary trade intelligence over the preceding decade to know that number was almost certainly wrong, or at least badly incomplete, either a deliberate human deception, or a failure of Imperial sensor technology to detect ships built using principles the Empire's threat assessment algorithms weren't designed to recognize. He said nothing to the officers around him, who were already celebrating what looked, on paper, like exactly the kind of overwhelming numerical advantage the War Council had promised. The second dispatch arrived 6 hours later, and it was shorter and considerably less triumphant. Fleet has engaged primary human defense force. Engagement ongoing. Will report further at next transmission window. Thural read that second dispatch standing alone in his quarters, having left the officers' mess the moment the first hints of unease began spreading through the room, unwilling to let his own reaction be witnessed by officers who did not yet understand what they were looking at. He spent the following 6 hours doing something he had not done since the earliest, most desperate years after Kelvara. He paced back and forth across the small confines of his quarters, turning over every fragment of intelligence he had gathered across 3 decades, searching for some detail that might suggest a more favorable outcome than the one he feared, and finding none. He thought, during those 6 hours, of Yevasorn, the young cruiser captain who had raised the lone cautious question during Kess's confident pre-departure briefing. He thought of the 41 names etched into the Memorial Gardens stone marker, and of how many more names might soon require a marker of their own. He thought, most of all, of the particular, unbearable helplessness of a man who had spent 31 years trying to prevent exactly this outcome, only to be left standing alone in a small room, unable to do anything now but wait for confirmation of what he already knew was happening light years away. The third dispatch did not arrive at the scheduled transmission window at all. It arrived 4 hours late, garbled, partially corrupted, relayed through a communication buoy that Imperial engineers would later determine had nearly been destroyed by whatever had happened in the system it was monitoring. What survived of the transmission was fragmentary, but Thural, reading it alone in his quarters at 3 in the morning station time because he had stopped being able to sleep through the night weeks earlier, understood immediately what he was looking at. Fourth Fleet sustaining heavy losses, unable to confirm status of dreadnoughts Corvin's Reach and Iron Providence. Human vessels employing unknown weapons technology penetrating shield arrays at ranges beyond effective countermeasure response. Marshal Kess requesting immediate reinforcement. The transmission cut off there. Thural sat with it for a long time, the cold, familiar weight of it settling over him like something he'd been carrying for 31 years and had simply never managed to fully put down. He thought about the 11 minutes over Kelvara. He thought about the calm, unhurried precision of a species that did not fight the way anyone expected it to fight, because it had never needed to prove anything to anyone by fighting loudly. He did not sleep that night either. For 9 days after that fragmentary transmission, no further word arrived from the Second and Fourth Fleets. Amistrar Station, which had been a place of confident celebration barely 3 weeks earlier, settled into a different kind of atmosphere entirely, a strained, brittle quiet that Thural recognized from long, hard experience as the particular texture of an institution beginning, very slowly and very reluctantly, to understand that something had gone badly wrong. Official statements from Fleet Command grew shorter and vaguer with each passing day. Public briefings, initially scheduled daily, stretched to every other day, then to no fixed schedule at all. Thural, watching from his administrative posting with the same helpless, practiced attention he'd maintained for 3 decades, began to notice the small signs of institutional panic, senior staff meetings extending late into the night, unusual troop movements around the station's own defense grid, a sudden and unexplained increase in encrypted traffic between Amistrar and the Imperial capital. On the 10th day, a single vessel returned. It was not one of the 200 ships that had departed with such confidence weeks earlier. It was a small, badly damaged courier craft, limping into the station's docking bay on backup thrusters, its hull scored with impact damage that the dock crews who first inspected it described, in reports that later circulated informally throughout the station despite official efforts to contain them, as unlike anything in our current damage classification system. The courier carried a single survivor, a junior communications officer named Isran Ball, 26 years old, who had been aboard one of the Fourth Fleet's support vessels when the engagement began, and who had, through a combination of luck and the ship's own emergency protocols, been ejected in an escape pod during the chaos and eventually recovered by the courier craft's automated systems days after the fact. Thural requested, and after considerable and uncharacteristic insistence, was granted, permission to interview him directly. Isran Ball was a small, wiry young man, and when Thural entered the medical bay where he was recovering, he found him sitting upright in his cot, staring at the far wall with the particular fixed, unblinking stillness of someone whose mind was still, days later, somewhere else entirely. General, Isran said, when he noticed Thural, and his voice was flat, careful, the voice of someone deliberately keeping himself very calm. They said you might come. I'm sorry to intrude, Thural said, and meant it. I need to know what you saw. As much as you can tell me. Isran was quiet for a long moment. They didn't attack us like an enemy, he finally said. That's the thing nobody back home is going to understand from the reports. I've read the reports they're drafting. They call it an ambush, a tactical surprise. It wasn't that. It was, Marshal Kess brought 200 ships into that system expecting a battle, the kind of battle we train for, formations and exchanges and attrition. The humans didn't fight a battle. They fought a problem. Like we were an equation they'd already solved before we arrived, and the fighting itself was just the part where they wrote down the answer. Go on, Thural said, quietly. Our sensors kept telling us we were winning, Isran said. Right up until we weren't. They let us commit deep into engagement range. Let our formations spread out exactly the way our doctrine says they should. And then it was like every weakness in our formation, every gap between shield coverage, every ship that had drifted a fraction too far from support, all of it got hit at once, in the same 30 seconds, by weapons that didn't behave like anything in our threat catalog. Kinetic rounds moving fast enough that point defense never even registered them as threats until they'd already gone through 3 decks. Coordinated strikes that hit exactly the ships that mattered most, command vessels, supply ships, anything that would cripple our ability to regroup before they bothered with anything else. And Marshal Kess? Isran's face did something complicated. The Amastrar's glory took 4 separate hits in under 2 minutes, each one precisely placed. I don't think that was luck, General. I think they knew exactly which ship he was on, and exactly where to hit it, and they didn't need more than 4 shots to do what they came to do. He looked up, finally meeting Thural's eyes. I heard he made it to an escape pod. I don't know if he survived transit. Nobody official has said. Thural sat with that for a long moment. How many ships survived, he finally asked. I don't know the final count, Isran said. But before I was ejected, I watched the tactical display for as long as I could stand to. I counted, General. I counted because I couldn't make myself stop counting. Out of 206 ships, I saw 41 still showing active transponder signals when I lost the feed. 41, General. And I don't know how many of those made it out of the system afterward. The number settled over the small medical bay with a strange, unwelcome weight. Thural said nothing for a long moment, turning it over in his mind, 41 ships still showing signals, against 41 names carved into a Memorial Gardens stone marker 31 years earlier, a coincidence of numbers that meant nothing in any practical sense and that he nonetheless found himself unable to shake for the remainder of that day. He had spent 3 decades measuring the cost of Kelvara in a single figure, carried so long it had become almost a private unit of grief, and now here it was again, echoing back at him from a catastrophe 100-fold larger, as if the universe itself were insisting he understand exactly how much the intervening years had failed to change. Thank you, Thural finally said, quietly, for telling me plainly. Most officers, in your position, would soften it, for my sake or their own. Isran looked at him for a long moment, something like recognition passing across his tired, hollow features. I read your assessment, General. Before we departed. It was required reading for communications staff, buried in a briefing packet nobody expected anyone to actually finish. I finished it. I want you to know that, whatever else happens to my career after this, I finished it, and I believed you, and I still climbed aboard that ship anyway, because refusing an assignment wasn't something junior officers were permitted to do. I don't know if that makes what happened easier or harder to carry. I suspect I'll be deciding that for the rest of my life." Neither of them said anything for a while. What Isran Ball could not have known, sitting in that medical bay describing a battle he had barely survived, was how closely his account matched the version of events that would, decades later, become a matter of settled public record on Earth itself, declassified, studied in military academies, taught as a case study in restraint married to overwhelming preparation. Admiral Marcus Webb, who had commanded Earth's defense fleet during the Seoul engagement, gave a single public interview on the subject some years afterward, at the insistence of a historian compiling an account of humanity's early interstellar conflicts. He was, by that point, an old man himself, and his description of the battle carried none of the triumphant bravado that might have been expected from the commander of so lopsided a victory. "We didn't want that fight," Webb said, in the recording that would eventually find its way, through channels Thural never fully traced, into a handful of Calrothy historical archives. "We spent 9 months building a defense specifically so we'd never have to actually use it. Every ship, every position, every contingency was planned around a single goal, making the fight so decisively unwinnable for anyone who started it that nobody would ever be foolish enough to start it. We hoped the fleet massing on our sensors would take one look at what we had waiting and turn around. They didn't. So we did what we'd spent 9 months preparing to do, and we did it as quickly and as completely as we could, because a fight that ends fast is a fight that costs less blood on both sides than one that drags out." The interviewer asked him, according to the surviving transcript, whether he'd felt any hesitation about the scale of the losses inflicted. "Every single one," Webb said. "I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. We didn't celebrate what happened in that system. A lot of people died who didn't have to, because their own leadership sent them somewhere they shouldn't have gone, believing things about us that weren't true. We gave every ship a chance to surrender the moment the outcome was no longer in doubt, because killing more of them than necessary was never the goal. The goal was making sure nobody ever needed to ask that question again." The interviewer pressed further, asking whether Webb believed the engagement had achieved its purpose. "I don't know yet," Webb said, and something in his voice, according to the historian who conducted the interview, carried a weariness that didn't match the scale of the victory he was describing. "Every species eventually forgets a lesson it didn't personally learn firsthand. I hope whatever came out of that fight lasts longer than my lifetime. I hope the next generation doesn't have to relearn it the hard way. But I've read enough history to know hope isn't a strategy, so we kept building anyway, in case they, or someone else, ever needed reminding." Thural never saw that interview. It would not surface in any form accessible to him for years, if ever. But had he seen it, he would likely have recognized, in Webb's careful, unhurried words, precisely the same quality he had spent 31 years trying and failing to describe to a council that had never once fought the thing he was warning them about, not cruelty, not ambition, but a species that had learned, at some cost he could only guess at, exactly how much preparation patience actually required. "Did you see how it began?" Thural finally asked. "The opening minutes. Before the formation broke." Isran nodded slowly, and something in his posture changed, as though he were bracing himself to walk back through it one more time. "I was monitoring support vessel traffic when it started, so I had a wider view than most of the combat crews. Our sensors picked up the human defense force almost 40 minutes before engagement range, 11 ships, exactly as reported, holding position at the edge of the system in a loose formation that our tactical analysts read as defensive, maybe even hesitant. Marshal Kess ordered the fleet to advance in standard envelopment configuration, the same doctrine we'd have used against any minor power. I remember thinking it looked almost too easy. 11 ships against 206. And then? And then the 11 ships didn't retreat, and didn't scatter, and didn't do anything our formation was built to counter, Isran said. They held position until we were fully committed, deep inside what our own doctrine calls the point of no advantageous withdrawal, and that was when the rest of it arrived. Not reinforcements exactly. It was more like the 11 ships had simply been the visible piece of something much larger that had been sitting dark, powered down, sensors baffled, scattered through the system's asteroid belts and the shadow of its outer moons the entire time we were making our approach. I counted, from what I could see on the wider tactical feed before it went to chaos, at least 60 additional signatures that lit up all at once, from a dozen different vectors, none of them where our sensor sweeps had told us anything could be hiding. A trap, Thural said quietly. A trap we walked into with our eyes open, because our own intelligence told us there was nothing to see, Isran said. That's what I keep coming back to, General. It wasn't that they were faster, or stronger, in any way that felt unfair. It's that they understood exactly what our doctrine would tell us to do, and built the entire engagement around the assumption that we would do it. They didn't beat our weapons. They beat our confidence in our own sensors, and by the time anyone realized that, there wasn't a formation left to uncommit from. Thural nodded slowly, and said nothing for a while, because there was nothing left to say that would not simply be a variation of the same warning he had already given 4 times and had 4 times been ignored. They gave us a chance to leave, Isran finally added, quietly, almost as an afterthought. Before they finished. A broadcast to every surviving ship. I heard it myself. A human voice, very calm, saying that any vessel that disengaged and transmitted a surrender code would not be pursued. General, that's not how the reports are going to describe this. But that's what happened. They beat us as badly as they possibly could, and then they let the survivors go, because I don't think they needed to kill us to make their point. I think killing us was never really the point at all. The official casualty figures, when Fleet Command finally released them 3 weeks later, confirmed the shape of what Isran Ball had described, though stripped of everything that had made his account so difficult to hear. 161 vessels destroyed or lost beyond recovery, out of 206 committed to the operation. Fleet Marshal Kess was confirmed among the survivors, recovered from an escape pod 4 days after the engagement, though the official reports on his condition remained vague in ways that Thural, reading between the careful bureaucratic language, understood to mean the man had not come home entirely whole. The remaining 45 vessels had returned to Imperial space in a scattered, uncoordinated retreat, most of their crews refusing, according to the debriefing summaries that eventually circulated among senior officers, to discuss the engagement in any detail beyond what was strictly required. There was no invasion of human space. There was no occupation force landing on human colonies, no annexation ceremony, no tribute extracted. There was only a broken fleet limping home, and a silence from human space that was, in its own way, more unsettling than any triumphant declaration of victory could have been. Earth's government issued a single formal statement in the weeks following the engagement, transmitted through the same diplomatic channels the original ultimatum had used, and it was, Thural noted when he finally read it, almost identical in tone to Elena Reyes's original response months earlier. The Calrothy Empire initiated hostilities against sovereign human territory. Those hostilities have ended. We remain willing to discuss trade and diplomatic relations on equitable terms, should the Empire wish to pursue that path in the future. We do not seek further conflict. No threats. No demands. No gloating accounting of the damage inflicted. Just the same flat, patient calm Thural had first encountered 31 years earlier, over a system called Kelvara that nobody in the Empire had thought worth remembering until it was far too late to matter. The reaction among the merchant houses that had championed the sole annexation directive was, in the weeks following the disaster, a study in the particular cowardice of people who had never expected to personally bear the cost of their own confidence. Corvain Oleth, who had stood in council chambers 18 months earlier arguing that human restraint proved weakness rather than patience, had lost 2 of his own family's transport vessels in the engagement, pressed into naval service as part of the merchant house's contribution to the operations supply train, a gesture of support that had seemed, at the time, a shrewd political investment. He did not attend the closed council session where Thural finally delivered his reckoning. He resigned his council seat quietly 2 weeks later, citing personal matters, and retreated to family holdings on the Empire's outer rim, where he would spend the remainder of his life declining every request for comment on the vote he had once championed so confidently. Other members of the merchant coalition were less quiet about their retreat. A formal statement, issued jointly by what remained of the Trade Council 11 days after the fleet's return, attempted to distance the merchant houses from the decision entirely, describing the vote as having been driven primarily by military assessments beyond the Council's technical expertise, a characterization that Thural, reading it in his quarters with the particular tired contempt of a man who had watched the actual vote happen, found almost impressive in its dishonesty. 36 votes had been cast for war. 14 of them had belonged to merchant delegates who had spent the preceding year lobbying enthusiastically for exactly the outcome they now claimed to have merely deferred to. Thural did not publicly correct the record. He found, in the aftermath, that he had lost most of his appetite for that particular kind of vindication. What mattered now, he told himself in the private log he still kept most nights, was not assigning blame to the people who had ignored him, but making certain the mistake was not repeated by whoever came after them. Blame was a comfortable place to rest, and he had watched too many careers, including, in its own quiet way, his own, waste years resting there instead of doing the harder work of making sure the next warning actually landed. He did, however, request and receive access to the full council voting record, and spent one long, solitary evening reading through the names of every delegate who had voted for war, cross-referencing them against the eventual casualty lists of ships their own family holdings had contributed to the operation. It was not a kind exercise. He did not share the results with anyone. But he kept the document, filed alongside his private log, a record he suspected he would need again someday, when the next generation of ambitious delegates began arguing that caution was simply the fear of old men who had never gotten over one bad day. He was summoned, for weeks after the engagement, to a closed session of what remained of the War Council, a smaller, quieter gathering than the one that had voted for war, several of its former members conspicuously absent, either dead in the fleet's destruction or simply unwilling to face the room where they'd cast their votes. Fleet Marshal Kess was there, seated rather than standing, his left arm in a medical brace, his face carrying an expression Thural had never seen on him before and understood, with a strange and unwelcome sympathy, all too well. "General Thural," Kess said, when the session opened, and his voice was quieter than Thural remembered it. "You were right. Thural did not enjoy hearing those words nearly as much as he had once imagined he might, in the bitter years when he had rehearsed this exact moment in his head more times than he cared to admit. "I take no satisfaction in it, Marshal," he said, and meant that too. "I know," Kes said. "That's precisely why I need you to tell this council, plainly, what I failed to understand. Not for my sake. For whoever sits in this chair after me, the next time someone suggests testing them again." Thural looked around the room, at the remaining council members, at the empty seats where 36 confident votes had once sat, and understood that this, finally, after 31 years, was the moment someone was actually prepared to listen. He walked to the podium, the same worn floor beneath it, and set down the same assessment he had submitted 4 times over 18 months and been ignored 4 times over. "I am not going to tell you they are unbeatable," he said. "I don't believe that, and I don't think it would be useful even if I did. What I am going to tell you is what I told this council before the vote, and what I have spent 31 years trying to make anyone understand. They do not fight out of anger. They do not fight for glory, or for territory, or to prove anything to anyone. They fight, when they fight at all, because someone made them decide it was necessary, and once that decision is made, everything that follows is simply the patient, methodical execution of a conclusion they already reached before the first shot was fired. They are not dangerous because they are cruel. They are dangerous because they are unhurried and thorough, and they have never once, in 31 years of every engagement I have been able to document, shown any sign of forgetting a single lesson learned along the way." He paused, looking around the quiet room. The mistake this council made was not underestimating their weapons, or their numbers, or their technology, though we underestimated all 3. The mistake was assuming that a young species, encountered only decades ago, could not possibly have already learned everything it needed to know about surviving contact with us. They had 31 years since Kelvara to prepare for exactly this day. We had 31 years of warnings, and chose, 4 times, not to listen to a single one of them. Kes was quiet for a long moment after that, his good hand resting on the table's edge, his gaze fixed somewhere past the assembled council members, on nothing Thural could identify. "I keep returning to something Captain Sorn said to me before we departed," Kes finally said, his voice low enough that the room had to lean in slightly to hear it. "She asked what contingency we had if the intelligence assessment proved wrong. I told her confidence mattered more than contingency. I believed that, General. I want the record to reflect that I believed it completely, not out of arrogance, but because every report I had ever been given told me it was true. I have spent 4 weeks trying to understand how an empire with our resources, our intelligence networks, our centuries of experience assessing new powers, could be so completely and catastrophically wrong about a single question. I do not have an answer that satisfies me." "I have one," Thural said quietly. "It is not a comfortable answer, Marshal, but I will offer it, since you asked." Kes nodded for him to continue. "We were not wrong because our intelligence was bad," Thural said. "We were wrong because we only ever asked our intelligence networks the question we wanted answered: how strong are they, compared to us? We never asked the question that mattered, which is how would a species that valued patience and precision choose to demonstrate strength it preferred not to advertise. Every report we gathered was accurate as far as it went. It simply never went far enough, because nobody wanted to fund the kind of investigation that might come back with an answer inconvenient to the outcome the court had already decided it wanted." The room absorbed that in silence for a long moment. Finally, the council's presiding officer, an elderly stateswoman named Coravel Das, who had voted against the sole directive and survived long enough to see herself proven right, spoke for the first time that session. "What would you have this council do now, General? Beyond the obvious lesson of humility?" Thural considered the question carefully before answering. "I would have this council understand that humility is not a policy. It is, at best, a starting point. What I would ask for, specifically, is a standing intelligence directive, permanent, adequately funded, insulated from the political pressure of whichever faction currently wants a war, dedicated to understanding not merely the military strength of powers we encounter, but the values and doctrine that shape how they choose to use it. Kelvara taught me that humans do not escalate the way we expect. Nothing in the 31 years since has taught me anything different about any other species we may one day misjudge in the same way. I would rather this empire never need that lesson again. I do not think we will be fortunate enough for that to be true unless we build the capacity to learn it in advance, rather than after the fleet has already sailed." Das considered his words for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before turning to address the room as a whole. "This council will vote, at its next formal session, on establishing exactly such a directive, with General Thural as its founding chair, should he accept the appointment." She paused, looking directly at Thural for the first time that session. "I suspect I already know the answer, but I will ask regardless. Will you accept it, General?" Thural was quiet for a moment, thinking of 31 years spent building an archive nobody wanted to read, of a private log kept for an audience of no one, of 41 names in a memorial garden that had, until recently, seemed likely to remain the full and final measure of what his warnings had cost to ignore. "I will," he said. "On the condition that whoever succeeds me in that role, one day, is never made to spend 31 years waiting to be believed." There was no formal applause, no ceremonial acknowledgement. The room was still too raw, too recently emptied of confident young officers who would never return, for anything resembling celebration. But Das nodded once, with the quiet finality of a decision made and recorded, and the session moved on to its next order of business, leaving Thural standing at the podium a moment longer than necessary, absorbing the strange, unfamiliar sensation of having finally, after 3 decades, been heard in time to matter for whatever came next. The council did not vote on anything that day. There was no formal resolution, no dramatic reversal of policy captured for the historical record. What happened instead was quieter, and in its own way more significant. The Empire's approach to human space simply, gradually, permanently changed. The transition was neither smooth nor immediate. In the first weeks after Thural's testimony, a faction of the remaining council members quietly pushed for a face-saving second engagement, a smaller, more carefully planned operation intended to recover some measure of the Empire's damaged prestige rather than allow the defeat to stand unanswered. Thural spent 3 exhausting months in closed-door meetings systematically dismantling every version of that proposal, using the same patient, thorough method he had once used to build his original assessment, until the faction pushing for renewed conflict finally lost enough support to abandon the idea entirely. It was, he reflected privately, a strange kind of victory, winning not by proving a point, but by simply outlasting everyone still too proud to accept that the point had already been proven at a cost of 161 ships. Trade delegations, when they were eventually sent, arrived without escort fleets and with instructions to negotiate rather than demand. Border patrols near Concord-adjacent territory were quietly issued revised engagement protocols that Thural, Consulted now as a matter of course rather than dismissed as an old man's obsession, helped draft himself protocols built around caution, patience, and the explicit instruction to never, under any circumstances, mistake human restraint for weakness. Fleet Marshal Kess resigned his commission 8 months later, citing injuries from the engagement, though Thural suspected, and never asked directly, because some things were not his to ask, that the injury that mattered most had not been physical. Before Kess's departure was finalized, he requested a private meeting with Thural, an unusual gesture between a departing commander and the man about to inherit his position, and one Thural nearly declined before deciding, in the end, that he owed the man at least this much. They met in a small, unremarkable officers' lounge on Amistrar Station, away from the formal chambers where their more public exchanges had always taken place. Kess looked older than his years, his medical brace finally removed but his left arm still moving with a careful stiffness that suggested it would never fully recover its former range. He poured them both a drink without asking, an old habit from better days, and set one down in front of Thural without comment. "I've spent 8 months trying to understand something," Kess said, "and I find I can't do it alone. I was not a foolish officer, General. Whatever the council minutes eventually say about my judgment, I want you to understand that I reviewed the intelligence available to me carefully, weighed it against 30 years of my own successful campaigns, and made what I genuinely believed was the sound decision. I need to understand how a man can do everything right by every standard his training provided, and still be so completely wrong." Thural considered the question for a long moment before answering, turning his glass slowly without drinking from it. "I don't think you did everything right, Marshal," he said, not unkindly. "I think you did everything your training told you was right, and I have come to believe, over 31 years, that this is not always the same thing. Our doctrine was built fighting species that thought the way we think, that valued territory, that escalated predictably, that could be read and countered using the same assumptions that have served this empire for centuries. Humanity did not write its doctrine to satisfy our assumptions. It wrote its doctrine to solve its own problems, in its own way, and any commander who tries to counter it using tools built for an entirely different kind of opponent will keep losing, no matter how skilled or how careful he is, until he learns to ask different questions." Kess was quiet for a while, staring into his glass. "I keep thinking of the ships," he finally said. "Not the numbers. The names. I knew most of those captains personally, General. I promoted several of them myself. I keep running the numbers in my head, wondering which decision, exactly, was the one that killed them. Was it the vote? Was it my formation? Was it something smaller, some order I gave without thinking, 3 days into the campaign, that put a particular ship exactly where it needed to be for them to end it? I don't have an answer that will help you carry that more easily," Thural said quietly. "I have carried the same question about 41 names for 31 years, and I have never found an answer that made it lighter. I have only found that the weight becomes more bearable if you use it for something, rather than simply carrying it in silence the way I did for most of those years. Do not resign quietly, Marshal, and disappear to the rim to drink alone with your ghosts. Whatever you do next, make it useful. That is the only thing I have ever found that made any of this bearable at all." Kess looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable passing across his tired features, and then nodded slowly. "I intend to write," he said. "A full account, as honest as I can make it, of every decision I made and why I made it, intended for training every future officer who might one day be tempted to make the same ones. I owe them that much, I think. More than I owe myself any comfortable retirement. That, Thural said, is a better use of the weight than most I have witnessed. He was replaced, in an appointment that surprised absolutely no one who had watched the previous year's events unfold, by Vecth Thural himself, promoted to Fleet Marshal at 62 years old, 31 years after losing an eye and 41 crew members to a single unarmed mining vessel over a system called Kelvara. He did not enjoy the promotion the way he might once have imagined he would, in the bitter years of banquets where no one made room for him at the table. It had cost too much, arrived too late, and come wrapped in the weight of every warning he'd given that no one had wanted to hear until it no longer mattered whether they heard it or not. But he took the position because someone needed to, and because he understood, better than anyone else in the Empire, exactly what kind of caution the role would now require. 3 years later, Fleet Marshal Vecth Thural stood before a very different war council, in the same chamber where he had once been dismissed as the ravings of an old man who never got over losing an eye to farmers. The chamber itself had changed little, the same tiered seating, the same banners of old campaigns hanging along the walls, though a new addition had been made beneath them at Thassa's insistence, a small, unadorned plaque listing the names of every crew member lost in the Soul engagement, a permanent fixture the council was required to walk past on the way to every session, so that no future vote could be cast without at least passing, however briefly, through the weight of the last one. A new proposal had arrived on the council's agenda, not concerning humanity this time, but a smaller, newer power at the edge of Concord-adjacent space, a species the Empire's intelligence services had assessed as weak, disorganized, and ripe for annexation. The language of the proposal was, Thural noted with a tired, familiar unease, almost identical to the language that had once been used to describe humanity. A young captain, freshly promoted and eager to make his case, stood at the lower podium, the same podium Thural himself had once occupied for 31 thankless years, arguing passionately that the intelligence assessment was incomplete, that the species in question had capabilities the Empire's threat models were failing to account for, that caution was needed before any vote proceeded. Several council members exchanged the particular, weary glances of people preparing to politely ignore an inconvenient warning. Thural recognized the look immediately. He had spent 3 decades being on the receiving end of it. Thural rose from his seat at the high table, and the room went quiet, because everyone in it now knew exactly what had happened the last time this Empire had chosen not to listen. "Council," he said, "I would like this young captain's full assessment entered into the record and reviewed in detail before any vote proceeds." There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. "Of course, Marshal," said the council's presiding officer, and this time no one argued. Thural sat back down and looked at the young captain still standing nervously at the podium, clearly unused to being taken seriously, clearly bracing for the dismissal he'd expected, and felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could easily remember, not relief exactly, and not vindication, but something quieter and more durable than either. After the session concluded, he found the young captain lingering near the chamber's entrance, uncertain, clutching a data slate to his chest with the particular anxious grip of someone who had expected to be humiliated and was still adjusting to the fact that he hadn't been. "Marshal Thural," the captain said. "Thank you for hearing me out." "Don't thank me yet," Thural said. "Being heard and being believed are different things, and this council will still need convincing beyond one old man's support. But I will tell you something I wish someone had told me 34 years ago, standing very near where you're standing now. He paused, studying the young officer's face, earnest, a little frightened, not so different from the face he imagined he himself must have worn once, before the years and the losses had worn something harder into it. Being right early is not the same as being right in time to matter. Do not simply file your warning and wait, the way I once did, for the weight of your own patience to eventually be recognized. Find every ally this council will let you have. Make the warning louder than your own discomfort with making noise. I waited 31 years to be listened to, Captain, and it cost this empire a fleet and a great many lives that a louder warning, delivered sooner, might have spared. The young captain absorbed that for a long moment, then nodded, slowly, and something in his posture straightened. I understand, Marshal. I hope you do, Thural said. I sincerely hope you do. The young captain hesitated, as though weighing whether to ask something further, and finally spoke again. May I ask, Marshal, after everything it cost, do you regret it? 31 years of being ignored, before anyone finally listened. Thural considered the question with the same careful attention he gave everything now. I regret that it took 31 years, he said. I do not regret spending them. A warning unspoken helps no one, Captain, whether or not anyone chooses to hear it. The only true failure would have been staying silent because I expected to be ignored. Remember that, the next time this council makes you feel that being right and being early is a burden rather than a duty. He walked from the council chamber alone that evening, past the small plaque bearing the names of the dead, and out into the wide, quiet concourse beyond, where the lights of 100 ships moved slowly against the dark through the great viewing windows that lined Amistrar Station's upper level. He thought, as he often did now, of Kelvara, of 11 minutes that had cost him an eye and 41 crew members and, in a sense, 31 years of a career spent shouting a warning into rooms that had no interest in hearing it. He stopped, as he often did on these evening walks, at the observation gallery where he had once watched the Second and Fourth Fleets depart with such confident fanfare, 3 years and a lifetime of grief ago. A new fleet stood at anchor there now, smaller, more cautiously provisioned, its officers trained under the revised doctrine he had spent the intervening years helping to write. He watched them for a while, young crews going about the unglamorous work of routine maintenance and supply loading, none of them aware that the old man watching from the gallery above had spent 3 decades of his life trying to ensure they would never need to learn, the hard way, the lesson that had already cost so many who came before them. A junior officer, passing through the gallery on some errand of her own, noticed him standing there and slowed, recognizing the uniform if not immediately the face. Fleet Marshal, she said, straightening with the particular nervous respect junior officers still reserved for him, even 3 years into his tenure. Is everything in order? Everything is in order, Thural said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he meant it. I was simply remembering an old lesson, and making certain I hadn't allowed myself to forget it. She looked faintly confused, as young officers often did when he spoke this way, but nodded politely and continued on her errand, leaving him alone again with the quiet hum of the station and the slow, patient drift of ships against the dark. He thought, too, of the fact that the warning had finally been heard, however late, however much it had already cost, and that somewhere out past the edge of the Empire's charted territory, a species that valued patience and precision above almost everything else had, in its own quiet way, taught an entire galaxy something it would not soon be permitted to forget. The Empire had learned, at last, the one lesson that mattered most, even if it had cost a fleet and 31 years to learn it, that the galaxy was full of quiet, patient, dangerous things, and that the wisest response to a warning was not to wait until silence proved it right. The END.